the public phase of Donald Trump's impeachment commences its second week of open hearings, stunning new details emerge about former National Security Advisor John Bolton's valiant and largely unsuccessful efforts to rally the cabinet to lobby Donald Trump directly to release military aid for Ukraine. Those efforts revealed in the testimony of Tim Morrison, a White House advisor expected to testify publicly tomorrow. Morrison also testifying about a previously unknown one-on-one meeting between Donald Trump and John Bolton. It was designed to sway Trump to free the aid. New York Times writes it this way, quote, "The meeting, which has not been previously reported, came as Mr. Bolton sought to marshal Mr. Trump's cabinet secretaries and top national security advisors to convince the president that it was in the United States' best interest to unfreeze the funds to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia." But Mr. Bolton emerged with Mr. Trump unmoved and instructed the aide to look for new opportunities to get those officials in front of Mr. Trump. The testimony tying Trump directly and seemingly unilaterally to the decision to withhold military assistance comes against the backdrop of more new testimony tying Trump to the conditioning of military aid in exchange for investigations into Biden. From the transcript of Morrison's closed-door testimony released over the weekend about Trump's reliance on EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland to carry out his orders, the Intel Committee Chairman Adam Schiff asks, Sondland understood his responsibilities to be doing what the president asked him to do. Morrison replies, he related to me, he was discussing these matters with the president. Schiff asks, and in fact, every time you went to check to see whether he had in fact talked to the president, you found that he had talked to the president. Morrison replies, yes, Mr. Chairman. And perhaps no one faces a greater risk and higher scrutiny than EU Ambassador Gordon Sondland when he testifies this week. It'll be on Wednesday. Brand new reporting in the Wall Street Journal from a reporter joining us momentarily offers a preview of what that testimony might hold. From her report, quote, a U.S. ambassador set to testify this week in the House impeachment inquiry kept several Trump administration officials apprised of his effort to get Ukraine to launch investigations that President Trump would later discuss in a July call with his Ukrainian counterpart. Emails reviewed by the Wall Street Journal show the investigation and the testimony closing in on Donald Trump's role in conditioning vital military assistance for a key U.S. ally on a commitment to launch political investigations is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us, the aforementioned Rebecca Ballhaus, White House reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Aaron Blake is back, senior political reporter for the Washington Post. With us on set, Republican strategist and author of Everything Trump Touches Dies, Rick Wilson, former aide to the George W. Bush White House and State Department, Elise Jordan, and NBC and MSNBC national affairs analyst John Hellman. Hellman, I want to start with you because there are now so many threads coming in the release of transcripts from the closed-door depositions, which is what precedes these public hearings that we're going to see this week. But braided together, they all tell the same story.
They do. They do tell the same story, and I think they're telling a story that is really a story that we've known for some weeks. None of this is like, it's not like any of these additional levels of detail are shocking or stunning, except in the largest sense they're shocking and stunning that they ever happened. But the picture is very clear now, and the layering of the evidence and the voices and who was in the room with whom and who made the call to whom and who heard what when is all an incredibly important part of building what seems like a rock-solid case. You've used the analogy of brick by brick of the way the evidence is being laid in, and I think the Democrats have gone about this in a very sturdy way, trying to get this case across.
Yeah.
Where I think we are right now, however, is that castle that's being built out of those bricks is going to be large and imposing and undeniable in what it looks like to anybody with eyes in their head. And yet, I don't think at this moment that castle, that edifice, is going to be enough to move Republicans in an appreciable number in either the House or the Senate to act in the way the Democrats are going to want to act with respect to the disposition of Donald Trump's presidency, which is why I think so much now hinges in a way on John Bolton. Because he is the person who can do something other than build the edifice, the person who, because of his credibility, because of his place in the world, because of what he means to conservatism, a certain branch of it, because of what his place in the world, and particularly the Republican world, the more we learn about him and his role in this and where he was and what conversations he had and what he was privy to and what he witnessed, if he came forward and told the story, it might be enough to start to shift the tectonic plates. It might, not necessarily, because we know Republicans are resistant to even powerful piece of evidence, but he's the wild card now, and man, he turns out to be the most high value target on the list by a long, long way.
Look, I'm reluctant to say this out loud because I don't want to put anything in the water that could disincentivize John Bolton from testifying if that's what he wants to do. Right. But I believe that John Bolton is the difference between conviction and no conviction in the Senate.
I think Bolton is incredibly consequential. I think John's right on target. Bolton has a symbolic value that transcends the Trump administration, because basically who was left in the Trump administration? A bunch of nobodies and dead-enders and fourth, fifth-tier people. Then John Bolton came in, and a few Republicans who had been a little nervous were like, okay, he's part of the long stretch from Reagan through today of conservative foreign policy. Whether you agreed with it or disagreed with it on the outside, John Bolton was a brand, and he was somebody who wasn't.
And I think to understand what he is to Republican foreign policy, he is what Scalia was to conservative judicial philosophy. Right. Yeah. I mean, he is the standard bearer of conservative foreign. I think he wrote a book during the Obama years. You know, basically, Obama makes us Obama makes us less. I mean, he is, and he was viewed as. I think almost too conservative by some people, even within the Bush administration. But in terms of going into this White House, he legitimized an otherwise reckless and ignorant and uninformed president.
And it speaks to one of their big thing. The Republicans put an awful lot of their bets on the hearsay phrase. That it's all hearsay, it's all secondhand, it's all thirdhand. Well, John Bolton clearly, from this reporting, was in the room talking to him about this, trying to undo what the president had, as you said, seemingly unilaterally declared we were going to do. And John Bolton can speak to the details, to the timeline, to motive. There's a lot here if Bolton decides to do the right thing.
You know, Aaron Blake, this reporting stopped me in my tracks, and Rebecca's done some great reporting on Bolton too, so I want to get both of you in on this. But this is from that New York Times piece that I read from in the lead. Bolton has emerged over weeks of interviews as perhaps the single most important witness who has evaded House Democrats as they build a case that Mr. Trump abused the powers of the presidency by withholding vital military assistance in a coveted White House meeting from Ukraine until it delivered investigations he wanted. The new disclosure only makes clearer the significance of his potential testimony. So the new disclosure, again, being this one-on-one meeting, a vivid picture painted, John Bolton inside the Oval Office, one-on-one with Donald Trump. He fails to move Donald Trump to unmove the aid, so he tries to lobby the cabinet. The last time we read about the cabinet being lobbied, it was Rod Rosenstein reportedly lobbying the cabinet to support the 25th Amendment. I mean, we know that when senior officials are lobbying the cabinet, things are really dark and really bad.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that occurs to me here is one of the threads in some of these witnesses who haven't necessarily turned on the president. They maybe offered a more sympathetic view of these events, like Gordon Sondland, like Kurt Volker. A lot of the undergirding of their testimony is that, yes, we did these things, but it was never explicit. It was never directly from the president. We didn't talk about these things in detail. He didn't tell me exactly what to do. With John Bolton, remember the timeline here. This is somebody who, as of July, was interrupting meetings where he was concerned about this arrangement being akin to a drug deal. This was a guy who was telling people after that July 25th phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky, was telling them to register their concerns with White House lawyers and memorialize these things because he wanted these to be on the record. This is a guy who, long before he would have been having this conversation, private conversation with President Trump, was very visibly concerned about what was going on here. So given that forum that he had with the president, given the substance of their conversation, it seems obvious that he would have been pressing the president on specifically what the conditions were for the release of that aid. And you have to wonder that if he ultimately does testify here, if he's going to have an unusual, a unique insight into just how explicit the president was about these quid pro quos.
Rebecca, we're so happy to have you. You've had some incredible scoops about John Bolton and throughout this entire impeachment story. I just want to ask you to sort of check my facts. I think Fiona Hill was the first witness that went in and really brought to life in vivid vivid and colorful language. John Bolton's feelings about what was going on, the pressure campaign against Ukraine. She called it a drug deal that Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. And that meeting that Hill testified to took place in the spring. So just talk a little bit about how Bolton widens the timeline from months before the July 25th phone call.
So it seems like Bolton back in the spring was referring to Rudy Giuliani specifically as a hand grenade, whose involvement in this whole affair was dangerous to the president, possibly. And we know that Fiona Hill testified to this July 10th meeting, which Bolton abruptly shut down after Sondland brought up investigations. And this was a meeting with Ukrainian officials, and Hill and others felt that it was inappropriate for Sondland to be pressuring Ukrainians to deliver these investigations as sort of a condition for a White House meeting. So what Hill testified is that Bolton shut that meeting down, subsequently referred to a drug deal between Sondland and Mulvaney, and instructed her and others to report their concerns to a White House lawyer. So I would just note that in addition to Bolton being someone who has firsthand knowledge of all these discussions, both with Sondland and with the president, Mulvaney is someone who's really emerged here as someone who was not only the recipient of the president's directive in July to put the hold on the Ukraine aid, but was subsequently in conversations and on emails with Sondland in which they were discussing this push for investigations.
You know, Elise, what's so extraordinary about this scandal is it's a cone that goes like this, with Trump at the top, and then you don't get too far below Trump before, as Rebecca's saying, you know, they're calling Rudy a hand grenade. You know, it's literally the guy right under Trump, John Bolton, his national security advisor, who says, I don't want anything to do with this. So the alarm goes, it's not like the kind of thing that has to get all the way down to, a whistleblower, for example. Literally the guy who's a direct report to the president, one of 9 people with walk-in privileges to the Oval Office, says, oh no, sends his aides to the White House counsel's office. I mean, this was a high-level scandal, like the highest level, directed by Donald Trump, and the alarm was sounded by his national security advisor.
Which is why John Bolton, we all want to hear from him so badly. I have never been one to defend John Bolton. He's a little hawkish for my taste. I'm more in the realist camp of Republican foreign policy circles, if there is still one of those. But in this case, I think he's playing it brilliantly by holding off and not just offering up the goods to the hearings to Democrats. I think that politically he is stronger if he goes through the courts, if he's seen as being resistant and not just immediately going and knifing Donald Trump in the back. And I would point out that John Bolton was only hired in the first place because Donald Trump saw him on Fox News. Right. He has so much credibility with that audience. He had been on it for years, as you mentioned, during the Obama administration, bashing President Obama's foreign policy. And so if he can slow play and if he can give the impression that he is not just offering the goods, I think it's better in the long term for his credibility.
I could talk about John Bolton for the whole hour. John Bolton also is someone who maintains relationships in places that Trump has no visibility into. Right. And by that, I mean, to the degree that there are still a handful of Republican senators, you know, who think about foreign policy. Right. You know who you are. John Bolton has a direct line to those people. And those are the kind of people who historically, before the last 3 years, would care about a relationship with a fragile democracy threatened by Russia being extorted by Donald Trump.
Right. And I think this goes back to the thing that both of you were saying, that we're all saying at the top of this. There's one element of this that where part of Bolton's importance is that he's the first-hand witness. He's in the room with Trump, and then he's lobbying the cabinet. There's like these various episodes. If you're writing this as a nonfiction narrative, there's some great scenes here that are waiting to be written. And if I'm writing this book, there's a few people whose deep background accounts of this I really want to get. In the same way, the country really needs to get this one from John Bolton, because these are going to be great scenes. And the first-hand element of it refutes one of the Republican talking points. But there's another element, right, which is that as you see this unfolding over the course of, as we get to the vote on impeachment, the articles of impeachment, then getting to the Senate, you know what Republicans are getting ready to say, which is if you get them off of it's all hearsay, you will then get to, okay, it's a quid pro quo. But it's not that bad a quid pro quo. It's certainly not a high crime. It's a mid-level crime. It's like a crime. Yeah, it's not a crime, right? all Bolton's behavior was, this is bad.
Unless a drug deal has been decriminalized, he calls it a crime.
This is not a small thing. Like John Bolton exercising all of the thing that he's most famous for besides his ideology, which is his bureaucratic infighting skills. He's a knife fighter. He sees things he doesn't like. He sees things that are not in his interest or he thinks are not in America's interest. And he figures out a way to pull the strings, to work the levers, to play the inside game, to cut those things off. This is a guy who knows how to get that stuff done. He failed here. And that tells you that the president was unmovable on this because he was unable. John Bolton's unable to get this thing stopped. That meant that the president really wanted it to happen. And secondly, John Bolton has his hair on fire here. He's running around saying, this is really bad. Not like kind of bad, not a little bad.
Drug deal bad.
Drug deal bad. And, you know, for conservatives, like drug deals about as bad as anything you can do.
We're still getting, so
not
that's
soft drugs either. This is not like a marijuana deal, okay?
All right. John will take his drug conversation and commentary. Rebecca, I want to get to your big scoop of the weekend because you are reporting, if you could just take us through what you're reporting about emails that it would appear the Wall Street Journal has reviewed, where Sondland, who's the other person, I don't know that there's anyone for whom the stakes are higher this week. I don't know that there's any other witness who's been accused by at least one Democratic House member of perjury, who has more riding on his testimony this week. Take us what he has in his emails.
So these emails that we reviewed show a couple of things. The first of which is that after that July 10th meeting that we were discussing, which Bolton allegedly shuts down and then complains about this drug deal, that about 3 days later, Sondland sends an email to an NSC official, Tim Morrison, in which he mentions the investigations yet again, says that the whole point of this call between Trump and Zelensky is that Zelensky's going to show that there's a new sheriff in town and that he's not going to impede any ongoing investigations or any new investigations from starting. And Tim Morrison essentially responds with got it and like tracking, I think is exactly what he says. So that's notable in light of the fact that there was supposedly this big fight a couple days earlier between the NSC and Sondland. And the second email chain that really stood out to us is one where on July 19th, so about 6 days before the Trump-Zelensky call takes place, Sondland tells Mulvaney and a couple of others, including Rick Perry, that the whole point of this call, again, is that Zelensky's going to get on the phone and assure him that he's not going to leave any stone unturned or something to that effect. And Mulvaney does not respond by expressing any alarm. Instead, just says that he's asked the NSC to set up the call.
You know, Aaron Blake, I wonder if you can sort of plug that into what was, these are dog years, but last Wednesday's blockbuster revelation was this evidence of another phone call between Sondland and Donald Trump that was played over a cell phone at a restaurant in Ukraine. Two more witnesses, or at least one more witness, has corroborated that. You've got the email evidence that Rebecca and her colleagues have reported on. What is the picture coming into focus around Sondland?
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see which way his testimony breaks. He's obviously somebody who has been reluctant to totally, rip the lid off of this scandal. He wants to not necessarily implicate the president. And even in his clarification, he made pains to say that it was his presumption that there was a quid pro quo in place, that he hadn't actually heard that explicitly from the president. He also said in that testimony that he only spoke with the president about 5 or 6 times. He made no mention in that testimony about the July 26th phone call, which seems a pretty pregnant omission from that testimony. I expect he'll have to clarify that, just as he clarified about the July 10th meeting. Look, this is somebody who is very much on his heels walking into that chamber this week. He could be somebody that Democrats see as a wounded animal, somebody who they could get to start talking in ways that he has been reluctant to before by maybe throwing him off his game a little bit. I think this is the most consequential testimony, barring John Bolton waltzing into one of these hearing rooms in the near future here, because it could just go in so many different directions.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.